Okay, we just wanted to start answering them.
Yeah.
Okay. Anyway, I'm Peter Schiff. I'm answering these 10 questions that got the most responses. Anyway, the first one comes from Oberdan. If you were fresh out of college and unattached to any geographical location, where would you move to maximize your future economic prosperity and why? Well, that's a tough question, and I think the answer would depend on a lot of other factors with respect to, you know, what languages I might speak. Certainly, if it's not me, what my ethnicity was, where my family and friends might be located, culturally where I thought I would fit in. There are a lot of other factors that you want to consider, not simply, what country, has the least taxes and the lowest regulation. But I guess the question comes from people who are thinking about how much more oppressive the U.S. government is going to be, how much higher the taxes are going to rise, both to fund government and to pay for the debts, how much more regulation there's going to be. And this country was really founded by people who fled other countries, searching more prosperity in the United States. And it's going to be unfortunate if this current generation, in order to find the same type of prosperity as their grandparents, ends up having to flee America in search of safer countries abroad. But certainly in the Asia Pacific region, there are a lot of countries where people can go if they want to be entrepreneurial. For people who only speak English, and you want to stay closer to home, you can even go up to Canada. You can go down to Australia or New Zealand. There are probably places in Europe that people can emigrate to. Hopefully, it doesn't get to that point. Hopefully, we can actually turn the situation around so that America can be once again an opportunity, an emerging market with a lot of potential. But right now, it looks like planning for an exodus might make good sense. Number two, from Infinite. Hyperinflation has always been accompanied by rising asset prices. Yet asset prices continue to be lower. Given that predicting hyperinflation is by itself useless, that is, eventually we'll see it within the next 10 years, 100 years, or 200 years, what time frame or signs do you envision for hyperinflation? Also, credit has been wiped out in the order of 20 plus trillion per year. I'm not sure if that's correct. Yet it's tough to print even 2 trillion per year. The math doesn't seem to add up to show hyperinflation will happen. Can you provide the math that will result? All right, first of all, I'm not necessarily predicting hyperinflation. I hope it doesn't come to that. I think hyperinflation is still a worst case scenario. It's not impossible. People like David Faber now, or Mark Faber rather, think that hyperinflation is a 100% possibility. I disagree. I think it's not a foregone conclusion. I do believe that we will have very high inflation. How high, I don't know. I think it will be much higher than we had in the 1970s, and that's the best case scenario. But just because credit is contracting and there's been a lot of bad debt doesn't mean that we can print money with impunity. We have to allow that deflation to occur. If the government tries to substitute the lost money with newly printed money, we will have inflation. By definition, that is inflation. You can't simply unwind the consequences of bad loans by printing money and say, well, it's okay because the debt went bad, therefore we can just print the money to replace it. When the debt went bad, that means that production didn't take place. And as far as prices are concerned, you have two dynamics. You have supply and demand. And if you have a reduction in the supply of goods, prices are going to rise. In addition to the fact that prices will rise because you have more money. And that's what's happening. We are printing a lot of money. We are subsidizing companies. We are bailing companies out. We are trying to artificially stimulate the economy. When this is going to be turned into a hyperinflation, if that happens, whether it's 2 years down the road, 5 years down the road, I don't know. But I do know that the effects of all this money printing are already showing up in the price structure, in the fact that prices have not fallen more precipitously, which is what we need them to do. In a recession, you want prices to fall, particularly asset prices like real estate, which have fallen, but they haven't fallen enough. They're still too high. But right now, you have some of the temporary factors that are holding prices in check, despite the fact that the government is printing a lot of money. But a lot of those temporary factors will give way and are already given way. And I expect to see meaningful increases in consumer prices soon. Asset prices, like real estate prices, will ultimately rise as well, but there is so much downward pressure on those prices, and ultimately, as interest rates rise as a result of increased inflation, that will also work to undermine asset prices. But ultimately, if we create enough inflation, asset prices will rise. And if there's hyperinflation, they will rise astronomically. But the increases will simply be in nominal terms. If you measure asset prices in terms of gold, for example, asset prices will plunge during hyperinflation. Assets will lose much more value in terms of gold in hyperinflation than they would just during a normal high inflation or in a period of deflation. But people are jumping to the erroneous conclusions that because we've had falling asset prices recently and consumer prices have been held in check, that inflation is not a concern. Inflation is every much good concern because inflation is our policy. Quantitative easing is inflation, and we are choosing to try to fight off a necessary deflation with inflation, and the government is going to win this battle, and all of us are going to lose. Number 3 comes from Quaker Routes. Did you read Paul Krugman's recent column called "The Big Inflation Scare"? How would you respond to his specific points, especially this one? Quote, banks aren't lending out their extra reserves. They're just sitting on them. In effect, they're sending the money right back to the Fed. So the Fed isn't really printing money after all. Well, I think most of what Krugman says is nonsense. I might have read that particular report. I'm not sure. I've read some op-eds that he's written on inflation and the fact that saying that inflation is not the problem. It's always been the problem. The reason we had an asset bubble was because of inflation. The inflation that the Fed created initially showed up in rising stock prices. It then showed up in rising real estate prices. That was inflation. Eventually it showed up in rising oil prices and other commodity prices, and it ultimately will show up in rising consumer prices. It doesn't make a difference in the short run if the banks are not making these loans. The money is still being created, it's still being put into circulation, and it will ultimately be spent. The fact of the matter is, we don't want banks to make loans. The reason that banks are in so much trouble is because of all the bad loans they made in the past. Why would we want to subsidize them and encourage them to do more of the same? We want banks to make good loans. We want them to make loans to businesses that have viable plans for capital investment and that can produce productively. The last thing we want is to encourage our banks to make more consumer loans, to loan Americans more money to buy stuff that they can't afford when they already can't pay back the money they already borrowed. Let me go to number 4. Comes from Cow with Beef. You mentioned considering a run for the Senate. What is your stance on the drug war and federal prohibition? If I were to run for the Senate, I have no idea whether I would make drug decriminalization a major part of my campaign. Unfortunately, I think there are more pressing concerns. But in general, my view of the government's war on drugs is it's been a complete failure. It's no more successful than the war on alcohol during Prohibition. And when the government made alcohol illegal, records show that alcohol use went up. But not only did alcohol use go up, but crime went up. And I think the laws that criminalize the use of drugs perversely create an incentive through high prices for pushers to sell drugs. And I end up thinking we have more drug use as a result of drug illegalization. And in addition, we've created a criminal problem out of a health problem. And I think maybe 90% of the people in jail are in jail because of drug-related crimes. And most of the crimes are thefts that people have to steal money to buy illegal drugs that are expensive. When if the drugs were legal, they would be a lot less expensive and people wouldn't have to commit crimes to afford them. Also, if drugs were legal, they would be much purer, they would be much safer, and so drug addicts would not have as much of a health risk as they do when they use illegal drugs, as if they used legal drugs. And I think if drugs were dispensed legally through a prescription-based system, where somebody wanting to use heroin would first have to go to a doctor and get a prescription for heroin, potentially he can be talked out of it. The doctor can try to reason with him, and are you sure you really want to start using heroin, and maybe put them through a program or let them see, the effects of it, and then if they want to make that decision. But the way it is now, heroin is pushed on people because there's a huge profit incentive to encourage the addiction. But as I said, if I end up running for the Senate, I don't know how big an issue that would be, and I don't even know if I want to make it an issue, because I do think that the biggest proponents of illegal drugs are organized crime. And potentially, if they thought that I was a credible threat to these drug laws, if they thought that I might actually legalize drugs, I don't know if I'd survive the campaign. So I think there'd be important things that I need to do, and I want to make sure that I go on living long enough to accomplish it. Number 5,